Hey everyone, Chris here. Welcome back. Now we are doing something a little bit different this week, and I'm giving you guys exclusive access to a masterclass video, and this is something that I do for channel members every month. You get exclusive access to ad-free masterclasses. And so I want to let you guys in on the secret and give you access to the latest masterclass. Now we just finished the T33, and so this masterclass is all about attaining perfect, beautiful finishes with spray cans. There is kind of an art to it, and so we deep dive on the subject in this video, and so I wanted to give you guys access to it. If you are interested in channel membership, you can join super easily. You get ad-free access to masterclass videos where we deep dive on all sorts of different subjects, and you guys are the guide on those too. And so if there's something you want to see specifically, you can request it and I'll do it for you guys. And also, you know, there's some additional members only content and updates that you get as well. And so yeah, I hope to see you guys in the members area and in the next masterclass. Hey there team, welcome to this month's masterclass. And so, you know, we've got the T33 done. So I thought I'd take a minute and talk about painting with spray cans. And so that is something that I leverage a lot because, let's be honest, I'm kind of lazy sometimes. And the reality is it's just simple. You don't have to worry about cleaning airbrushes or paint guns or anything like that. You literally shake it, spray it, and you're done. And so the simplicity of it is why I go that direction so much. But not all spray paints are created equal. And so that's really important to understand, because you may go in expecting a certain result and get something completely different to what you expected, and it could be solely based on the paint medium that was used. And so there are, of course, all types of different paint mediums, and so we'll touch on that a little bit. We'll talk about my go-to spray paints, and we'll talk about, you know, surface preparation and how to get crisp, clean paint lines when you are spraying with spray cans. And so yeah, let's get into it. And so first of all, I want to mention, right, I mentioned up front, not all spray cans are created equal, and I say that because it's really related to the type of paint and also the aerosol, or the tip, I should say. Certain tips and paints are going to spray better than others, and that's just kind of based on the quality as a whole. Higher quality paints are generally going to spray better, have better tips than lower quality paints. Now, in the case of the T33, I used two different types of spray cans, and it was mostly because it was related to the colors that I was looking for. And so that is the other part of this. Not always can you find the colors that you are looking for or that you need. And so as you go into it, you understand you may not be able to go with spray cans if there's a certain color that you need. And that's where I go to. I've got a Federal Standard color book, and I will spray paints onto plastic ABS pieces and compare them to my Federal Standard color book. Now, obviously, you may not have that. They're kind of harder to get nowadays. You can get the newer AMS standard color book, which is their new one. The FS color was outdated, but I can't stress the importance enough of using accurate colors in it. It used to be a lot easier when you had like the Model Master enamels. They had a nice assortment of Federal Standard colors. There are airbrush options these days, like the Mr. Paint brand is an airbrush only paint that comes in Federal Standard colors, and they've shown to be pretty accurate. Generally speaking, if you don't want to use an airbrush, that doesn't really help, right? So that's where my go-to paints for spray paints is the Tamiya brand. They are absolutely fantastic, and it is the AS sprays, which is aircraft spray, and it is the TS spray, which is just further assortment of colors. The AS sprays are directly intended for use on military aircraft, and so they've got World War II colors, they got modern colors. It's not an all-inclusive amount of colors yet, unfortunately, but for the most part you can get most of what you need there, and if there's something you can't find, then that's where you have to find another option. Now, In the case here, I actually used a Rust-Oleum white primer for the white, and that may or may not have been a mistake, because when I painted it, man, it took well over 24 hours to actually get hard and dry to the touch. It was tacky, and I don't know why it didn't dry as quickly as it normally does, if it was humidity or what, but yeah, thankfully it did eventually harden up and dry, and so I was able to paint the rest of the stuff over it. But when things like that happen, you just have to give it time. There's specific colors that sometimes take much longer to dry than others in the Rust-Oleum brand, and I don't know why that is. It just is what it is. So you have to be patient, and you don't want to rush it, because if it's not dry to the touch, then you definitely do not want to mask it, because you're going to end up marring the finish. So give it time. Absolutely important to do that. And so the reason I didn't go with the Tamiya AS white is it's actually kind of a little gray for an Insignia white, and although this is a little too white for Insignia white, but it just kind of is what it is. The Insignia white FS17875, which is the gloss version, or the flat version 37875, is kind of an off-white, almost eggshell kind of color, and so many people don't realize that, and they just think white is white. As it turns out, in military colors, white is not just white. Or if you've ever tried to paint the walls in your house, you know that white is not white. There's so many different variations of white, it's wild. That was the reason why I didn't go with the Tamiya sprays, because it's a little too gray. It's almost like a camouflage gray color versus the Insignia white. But otherwise, the orange, I used an engine block enamel paint. And that's a brand that I've used before. It's VHT, and it is actually really fantastic paint, and it's got a wonderful tip on it. And so I used it because that was the closest I could get to the international orange that I needed in a spray can, and it's pretty close. It's a touch too red if you guys saw the latest video, but it's pretty darn close. It's actually, that orange is closer to international orange than the white is to Insignia white, but don't tell anybody. You may go through a whole assortment of spray cans trying to find the right color. I mean, that's what I've done. But I will say that, you know, like I said before, patience in the process is absolutely imperative. Because if something isn't dry, you definitely don't want to start masking over it. And, you know, there are other options where you can get custom colors mixed and put into a spray can for you. There was a source that I used when I painted the chromate colors on the interior. That's actually a custom mixed chromate yellow that came in a spray can, and LVP paints, I think it was. And it's great, you can do that. The problem is that it's an acrylic enamel, and it takes really long to harden it. It dries quickly, but it's not fully hard when it's dry. And so if you don't give it time, and you start masking because it feels dry, you can still end up marring the paint because it's not really hard yet. And so I used that on my B58 Hustler, and it worked out okay, but sometimes you can do like a clear coat barrier between them or something like that to help so you don't get that paint marring. But I didn't realize that till after I had done painting and masking on it. There are those options, but at the end of the day, you really want a type of paint that's going to dry hard and it's going to dry well. Something that takes really long to harden doesn't become super useful at the end of the day, unfortunately, even though the color may be perfect. But if you're willing to give it that time, then, you know, it's fine. That's where the Tamiya AS and TS spray paints, they're a lacquer base, and they dry extremely quickly and they dry hard at the same time, and so that's one of the big reasons why I really like that paint a lot. The other part of this, just like painting anything, surface preparation is absolutely paramount, right? So we've gone through and like we're doing a refinish, we've cleaned up the entire surface, and so you need to do a wet sand with 600 wet dry of the whole airframe just to knock it down. You know, give the paint a good surface to adhere to, right? primer is essential. Primer helps promote adhesion, and then that preparation that you spend in the wet sanding. So, you know, you don't have to go wet sand it like crazy, but what you are doing is knocking down some of the dust that might have gotten into some of the primer coats and any roughness that may be coming through. And so when you do your paint, it's going to go on nice and smooth and not have a rough texture to it. From there, you know, when you're painting with spray cans, you got to shake the heck out of that can. You want to make sure it's thoroughly mixed before you start applying any kind of paint. And so once you have shaken it up for a good minute or so, spray it onto something first. I've got a trash can that's got tons of paint on it because that's where I test that stuff out. And so, you know, I'll spray it on the trash can, and then I will go through and start applying it to the model. And so, you know, just like as you're airbrushing or anything like that, you don't want to go too close because that's going to cause runs. But if you also go too far, it's maybe not going to cover. It's going to be really dry when it covers. So there's a happy medium. You know, generally about a foot away from the surface is about right. And you just, you know, moving across the surface, holding the tip down, spraying the paint down. But you don't want to spray it on super wet. If you gotta do multiple coats, there's nothing wrong with that. I know that like the Rust-Oleum paint is prone to running if you put it on too wet. The Tamiya paint, however, doesn't tend to run when you put it on wet. So it actually does kind of like to get applied that way. And that's just the nature of the paint. It's maybe got a little bit more body to it, and so it's not going to build up and just run in certain areas, which is really nice. And so, you know, ultimately though, you don't want to be spraying on the paint super heavy, super thick, all in one coat. Expect to do multiple coats because, you know, multiple thin coats is much, much better than one single heavy coat. It's the same with primer too. One single heavy coat, sanding that down is not going to do what you want. And so once you've got, you know, kind of your base colors down, it is then, of course, time for masking. Got to make sure it's all dry, of course. And then how do you get nice, clean paint lines with frog tape, which is what I used here, and spray cans? Frog tape I found to be actually a rather incredible tape. You know, I put it onto my cutting mat. It's this blue surface right here. And I lay it out. I'll cut it into strips depending on what I need. So if I need something that I can get around nice complex curves, I'll cut a really thin strip, maybe about 1/8 inch wide, because that allows me to bend and apply it in a complex curve, you know. Otherwise, if I've got straight lines, I might use, you know, the full width of the tape, or I might cut that in half or so. But what I will say is, for a foam refinish, you do want to de-tack the tape a little bit just to make sure that you don't lift up your surface at all. You know, you do have all this work you've done, and the poly and the filler and all that stuff, it does stabilize the surface. And it does make, you know, the surface underneath less prone to lifting up, but it still happens, especially if you have like a primer adhesion issue. So you still got to be pretty delicate with it. And so when you put the frog tape down, you know, I'll burnish it down. I've got like a little wood tool that I think is used for like nails or something. And I'll just burnish the edges down. And just make sure that, you know, it's nice and sealed. You're not pressing super hard when you rub it down, just enough to, you know, make sure that you've got a decent seal along the edge. And so then once it's taped, now I mentioned frog tape here because this is a foam refinish. You can use, the other tapes that I use is 3M fine line tape. That is a really fantastic tape, but you got to be careful on a refinish. It has the potential to lift up your finish. I stick to purely frog tape when I'm talking about foam refinishes. But when I have a fiberglass model or a composite model, I'll use 3M fine line tape because that is, man, incredible stuff. When you've put it down, I'll rub it down in that tape, you want it to change color. And so when you see it change color, that means you've got a really good seal down, and you'll get an incredibly crisp line with that if you do it right. Do it wrong, however, it won't work. So it's so important to make sure that that tape changes color. But otherwise, there are like vinyl fine line tapes that I've used as well, which do the same thing. But again, I'll use all of that stuff on other mediums, not foam. But for the foam, purely frog tape. And so when you've laid it down, you've got everything masked off, you covered for the overspray, so you don't get any overspray on anything. Then it's on to the painting it with the spray can. And so the orange was also done with a spray can. And so when you are applying that paint, the worst thing you can do is to flood it down all in one coat. Because that's most definitely going to result in runs underneath your tape, or bleeds, I should say, underneath the tape. Apply the coats, lightly apply it over the edge of the tape and slowly build up the paint in those areas that you're painting. And so that's going to help ensure that you don't have any paint bleed through the tape. Another option you can do, so that was the approach that I took here, and I got really nice crisp lines on this for the most part. There were a couple areas but you back mask, you can airbrush it to fix it, and it's no big deal. The other thing, there are other options you can do. So if you're not comfortable doing that, you can always, after you've masked it off, you can spray the base coat again, and that's going to seal the edge, and then you can spray. But again, you don't want to spray super heavy because that's only going to promote bleed underneath the tape. The other thing you can do is once you have it masked, you can apply a clear coat to seal it, and that'll help seal the edges of the tape. But again, if you apply the paint in the proper way, you will not have to do any of that. And so, light coats, building up gradually until you eventually then, fill out the entire color completely. And so again, that's what I did here on the T33, and it worked out. That's the approach I take on every spray can paint job that I do, is to build up the paint gradually in those taped off areas, so that way you don't end up with any kind of paint bleed under the tape. Now, when you are painting as a whole, there are some things to consider. Now, it's less of an issue when you're painting with matte paints, but environmental factors, basically humidity is the worst conditions you can paint in. So you want kind of dry, arid environment, sun, and obviously some places you can't avoid the humidity, especially in the summer, and so which is fine. You can work around that, and as long as you're painting outside and it's sunlight, the likelihood is the humidity is going to be less of a factor. And again, if you're spraying matte paints, it's probably going to not be an issue. Where it really becomes an issue is with gloss paint jobs and gloss clear coats, because high humidity and low heat can result in blushing of the paints and of the clear coats. And so what you have to end up doing is kind of color sand and polish and maybe even reapply the clear coat. Like gloss clears really require flooding it on pretty good. Military aircraft are flat, thank goodness, and so that makes things actually a lot simpler. It's actually a lighter weight finish too, because you don't have to flood on a clear coat super heavy. That being said, I do want to mention the environmental conditions because it is important. There are better days to paint on than there other days, right? So sunny for the most part, not super humid. Those are generally the best days to paint. And so of course you want to have nice, well-ventilated areas. Anytime you see me painting inside, my garage door is completely open and I've got fans going, so it's not like I've got everything closed in and I'm just breathing all that stuff in. It's nothing like that. So there's a lot you don't see on camera, and so otherwise, the big stuff, I'm always taking it outside, painting it. I've got my trash can and a foam pad, and I just spray it out there and just bring it in to let it dry. And so, I just want to mention that stuff. The other thing is, when you're painting this stuff, the inevitable is likely to happen. Drips, runs, bleeds, that is all a possibility, of course, right? And so handling that stuff, runs are really easy, actually. Basically, you let everything dry completely. You wet sand those down with 600 grit wet dry sandpaper. and smooth it out again by sanding it, and then you just go in and touch up those areas with the paint. You know, drips, runs, that's how you handle all that stuff. Now, let's say you've got a situation where you lifted up some paint. The process starts the same. So you're gonna wet sand that too, and maybe instead of wet sanding, you sand it with 180 grit to start, because what ends up happening is if you pull up some of that surface, you end up with, you know, kind of a hole, right? And so you kind of lightly sand that with 180 grit, and then you fill it back in. In the case of the T33 here, I actually had, while I was handling the model, I kept bumping the top of the dorsal tail. So when I pulled some tape off, the finish lifted up. So what I ended up doing is I sanded it with 180 grit sandpaper and then filled it with glazing putty. And there wasn't any foam exposed or anything like that. It just took it down to a primer level. I filled it in with the glazing putty, let that dry, and then sanded that to shape with 180 grit. And then wet sanded that, lightly primered that, and then wet sanded that again with the 600 grit, and then it was ready to touch up the paint. And so when you look at that, you can't even tell that any of the surface got lifted up in the process. And so, because what ends up happening is you know, you've got these paint levels, but then you've got this primer level down here, and so you have to build that back up so that it's all even again. And so if you have that paint lifting, you know, sanding, depending on how thick your layers are and how deep it goes, maybe sanding is all you need to do. But, you know, if it's deep enough, then you need to think about filling and building it back up so you can get an even layer again. Now, the final part of this is, of course, clear coats. Now, I went through all of the trim pieces on here, like the leading edges, the anti-glare areas, the wing walks, all that. That was all airbrushed with Mr. Paints. You can use spray cans there easily enough, but airbrushing is generally going to be lighter. And when you're dealing with small areas, and if you've got a fan tip on the airbrush, it makes things pretty quick and easy. The other part of it is clear coats, right? So once you've done all of your work, all your weathering, paneling, whatever it is you're going to do, you want to apply a clear coat to protect it all. And so I really like the spray can clears because they're just so easy to deal with. And the reality is, if you're using a lacquer-based clear coat, I mean, that'll stand up to even gasoline or kerosene. The one thing it won't hold up to is glow. Glow is pretty corrosive to paint as a whole, and so you really have to use an epoxy clear coat. And so it's going to be a two-part epoxy clear with, you know, the clear coat plus a hardener. That's really the only thing that'll protect you from glow fuel. But I don't know how many guys are still doing glow these days. But the other part of the clear coat is non-yellowing. And that is extremely important because over time, UV does result in yellowing of a surface if you don't have that non-yellowing protection. And so the things like, one of the questions I get a lot is, hey, can I use Minwax polyacrylic as a clear coat? And the answer is yes, you can, but I have found over time that it yellows. And so when I did my original P51 Lady Alice refinish, you know, I put that airplane out in the sun to let the poly dry, and the poly immediately turned yellow. And so while you can do that, expect that it's going to tarnish your finish over time. And so that's where using a dedicated clear coat with a non-yellowing agent in it is going to be the best bet. Now, guys do like, oh, can I get structural rigidity from the poly and stuff like that? I was like, yeah, you'll get a little bit. I think you get a little bit more when you do all of this work because we do additional coats of poly plus all the primer and all that stuff. It just helps stabilize things more because there's more layers. But you do get a little bit more stiffness and rigidity from Minwax polyacrylic. But if you've got a foam model and you just want to get some structural rigidity, sure, you can get a little bit from the poly, but just bear in mind that it may yellow. And so that's where if you apply a non-yellowing clear on top of that, then that'll help keep that from happening. You know, I just wanted to mention it because you know, there's more than one way to do any of this stuff. You know, this is just one method that I've you know, kind of developed and honed over multiple decades of modeling, but you know, there are other ways to accomplish the exact same things that we've got going here. And so I love to hear ideas and learn new techniques. I'm always learning and experimenting and trying different things, because sometimes things work and sometimes they don't, but you won't know until you actually try. So yeah, I think that about covers what I want to talk about with spray cans. If you guys have any questions at all, let me know. You can drop a comment down below. I'm happy to help. You can send an email or whatever. And so I hope that this is interesting and helpful. And like I said, I love using spray cans because it's just easy. And if you ever have a reason to use Tamiya aircraft spray paints, do so, because they are absolutely fantastic. And so I am in the works on kind of starting a new project that you can kind of see right there. I had a scratch build that's in the works, but I don't have those parts yet. And so I was thinking this guy might be next. And so that is an FW190 D9. And I will be painting that entire airframe. It's 1/5 scale. And I will be painting it entirely with Tamiya aircraft spray paints, I anticipate, because they are that good and the color looks absolutely perfect. And so, yeah, that's going to be a fun project. And hopefully it won't take too long to get. It's all composite. It looks amazing. It's got tons of surface detail. But anyways, all right, guys, that's it for this masterclass. And I hope it's helpful to you. And again, let me know how I can help you out. And I'll see you in the next one.